I actually tried migrating a Ruby project to an Elixir project, and these are kind of my personal opinions on it when I did that migration. It was a couple of years ago. But this is basically my rating of kind of what was good and what was bad. So the immutability, I actually really liked it because I felt it kept me safer, because being able to mutate state in certain cases can get you into trouble. So
Oh,
this
yes.
is one aspect of it I really liked. Elixir, this is more Elixir Phoenix, probably not, and Phoenix being the web framework complement for Elixir. They're more explicit, whereas with Ruby and Rails, there's kind of more magic behind the scenes that it just does stuff for you. I actually liked that Elixir was more explicit with what I had to do. I understood more of the guts of how things were working compared to me trying to read some Ruby code.
Hmm.
The pipeline operator, that's great. I like being able to just, that concept of taking inputs and putting it through a pipeline. I love that. Processing for jobs, I like this too. Basically, with a lot of big Rails apps, you have Redis and you have a bunch of workers that are running, like using Sidekick and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Elixir has its own methods for dealing this, where you can spawn processes easily and do things asynchronously. So this was super easy to set up without having to bring in something like a Sidekick, without having to have Redis as a dependency and stuff. So that was really cool. Using recursion instead of loops, it definitely requires thinking differently. So that, I called that, it was interesting, but it's definitely challenging. The pattern matching concept too is pretty much a challenge compared to assignment. The things I kind of liked less was having to compile things, because, wait around more. Yeah. And I ran into some issues when you update a file or you copy a file and you forget to change something, and then you have to recompile. It was a little bit more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
This is something interesting. When you actually look at it, the code readability and appearance, I think it's not as easy on the eyes and easy to just jump in and understand compared to Ruby.
That was one of my favorite things about Ruby. That specifically was the readability and the way it looked at. I mean, if you blur test a Ruby screen, it just looks nicer than most other languages.
Yeah, and Elixir is pretty good compared to other functional programming languages like C, because some of those can become super terse. But Elixir's pretty good. But I will say this, even with this, sometimes I've looked at trying to understand what a Ruby gem is, and a really hard time kind of understanding what a Ruby gem was doing. Sometimes that was written by someone else. I've had challenges comprehending it. And it was much easier when I actually, the Elixir equivalent is a mix package. So it's a contained library.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually able to read other people's code better with Elixir, I felt.
That's interesting. I mean, I will say I have seen a lot of terribly written Ruby code. So, it doesn't matter how nice the language is. If you write garbage code, it's just not going to be very readable. And you can make Ruby look like garbage if you want to. But by and large, that was one of the things that really attracted me to Ruby in the first place, was the readability and the intuitive nature of, I don't know what this method is called on this object, but I can take a guess because this is what I wanted to do. And usually I'm right,
Yep. And deployment, this was a challenge, I think, early on. I think they've done a lot for it as well. And this is mostly from the web framework perspective. And then they had a lot of frequent framework changes because it was definitely newer a few years ago. So that's calmed down. So I wouldn't necessarily classify these bottom two as still issues.
I can't think though of a language or a framework that I've used where I would give deployment anything better than a C. Deployment just seems to be a real pain in the butt no matter what language you're using. So I don't know that I'd hold that against Elixir or functional programming.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
And again, I'm kind of conflating, talking about Elixir and a lot of this, but it is, I'm using an example of the purest functional programming language I've used to try and give some comparisons. And this is kind of my thoughts on it, is that, getting started with Elixir functional programming language, the right way requires changing how you think and think and code when compared to Ruby. And you have to think more of on a functional basis, declarative basis, a stateless basis. Because a lot of the stuff will give you that concurrency.
Right. And I think that would be, that there would be a significant learning curve for me to start programming in Elixir. I don't think it'd be any worse than switching from like the desktop programming paradigm to the web programming paradigm, because then, you've got stateful and stateless and all kinds of different things you have to think about, different ways of thinking. But this, the stuff that because I'm thinking through this stuff you're talking about, these differences, and I'm like, man, if you took away looping structures from me, my brain would melt.
And a lot of conditionals.
Yeah. I understand what recursive is, but using that instead of a loop, I'm not sure I could wrap my head around that. But I'm kind of an idiot, so maybe it's just me.
Yeah, I think, again, I've seen references that it's a more mathematically consistent language. So maybe if you are strong in, and not saying you're weak in mathematics or whatever, but I think if you think a certain way, you can adapt to it easier, or may like it better. Because kind of that's again, from what I'm saying, I had to change the way I thought in order to program Elixir correctly. Right. But like you, it's kind of like in Ruby, hey, I want a loop, just type it out here. Whereas this, okay, I got to do recursive programming. All right, everybody, hold the phone. I got to think how to do,
Right.
Now, again, with more experience, maybe that will happen faster. Like if I was programming Elixir or functional programming language all the time, that may become more easy.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like probably the closer you are to the beginning of your career, the easier this is to pick up, just like kids have an easier time picking up other spoken languages than adults. Because, after 25 years of doing this OO programming, my brain just automatically thinks in a certain way. And so I have to, if I want it to do something else, like thinking about recursion instead of loops, I have to put the brakes on, because I'm automatically just writing loops, because I just know that, hey, if I'm trying to do this thing, it's a loop, And so undoing 25 years of brain training is a little more difficult than picking it up in, year 2 or 3, I'm sure.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff I like about it, but I definitely, because of that, having to think differently, and I think I'm slower writing it. But I think the programs I write with it are much faster.
Right.
Because, you fire up an Erlang virtual machine and it can immediately use every core on the machine. I actually did a demonstration. I didn't have time to put it together or to do it, but I actually simulated on my laptop firing off 1 million processes doing work. And it was from one Erlang virtual machine that then spread out to however many cores the laptop had, maybe 4. So I demonstrated this in a presentation, because a lot of what I showed here now is from a presentation I gave at a meetup. So for that, whereas doing something that is multi-threaded in Ruby is super, to me, is super complicated, starts getting super complicated.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, multi-threading in Ruby is not really, you can do it, but it's not kind of a frontline thought pattern for most Ruby developers. It's kind of relegated to the very special cases. Especially if you started in Ruby. I mean, I think about threading because I spent a lot of my career in desktop programming where threading was a big deal, and that's just how you thought about things. So I think about that in Ruby, but I rarely use multi-threaded stuff outside of letting the Ruby server itself handles
the infrastructure
things
that you're writing on top of handles a lot. Yeah,
right.
Handles a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, so I don't have to think about it, which is nice because I'll tell you, in .NET programming, threading is just, I'd rather poke myself in the eye with a fork than do threading in .NET anymore. I don't ever want to see that stuff again. That was just a nightmare. But
if you like this clip and want to watch another one, you can click right here. Or if you want to watch the full video, you can click here.